The room was thick with the scent of sweat and desire, the air heavy with the sound of ragged breaths, and the soft creak of the leather couch under their weight. His hands gripped her waist, fingers digging into her skin as he pulled her closer, their bodies moving in a rhythm that was both frantic and desperate. Her nails raked down his back, leaving faint red marks that would fade by morning, but for now they were a testament to the intensity of their passion. She moaned softly, her head thrown back, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of silk. He whispered her name, his voice low and husky, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. The office was dimly lit, the only light coming from the desk lamp that cast long shadows across the room. The blinds were drawn, but the faint hum of the city outside was a distant reminder of the world they had shut out. This was their secret, their forbidden sanctuary, where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. Here, they were not boss and secretary, not husband and wife, not father and young woman. Here, they were just two people consumed by a hunger that neither could resist. Her hands moved to his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. She could feel the power in him, the control he held over her, and it thrilled her. She had always been drawn to power, to the idea of being close to someone who could give her everything she wanted, and he had given her so much already: attention, validation, the promise of a promotion that would change her life. But this was something else entirely. This was raw, primal, and it made her feel alive in a way she never had before. He kissed her again, his lips claiming hers with a possessiveness that left her breathless. She could taste the faint hint of whiskey on his tongue, a reminder of the drink they had shared earlier, when the tension between them had become too much to bear. She had known what she was doing when she poured that drink, when she leaned in just a little too close, when she let her hand linger on his arm a little too long. She had wanted this, had wanted him, and now she had him. But even as she lost herself in the moment, a small part of her mind whispered a warning. This was dangerous. He was married. He had a wife, children, a life that didn't include her. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to care. Not now, not when his hands were on her, when his lips were tracing a path down her neck, when his voice was murmuring promises that she knew he might not keep. It had started innocently enough, or at least that's what she told herself, as she replayed the events in her mind. She had been working as his secretary for just over a year, a position she had fought tooth and nail to secure straight out of secretarial school. In that time, she had proven herself to be not just competent but exceptional, efficient in her meticulous organization of his chaotic schedule, reliable in her unwavering punctuality, and ambitious in a way that shimmered like a beacon through the mundane hum of office life. She was young, just 20 years old, her birthday having passed quietly a few months prior with a single cupcake and a candle she'd blown out alone in her cramped apartment. But her youth was no barrier to the drive that set her apart from the other secretaries, the typists, and the filing clerks who shuffled through their days with mechanical indifference. She wanted more money to escape the dingy one-room flat with its peeling wallpaper and leaky faucet, more power to command respect instead of being dismissed as just another pretty face, more recognition to prove to herself and the world that she was capable of greatness, since she was willing to do whatever it took to get it, even if it meant pushing boundaries she hadn't fully defined. He had noticed her almost immediately, a fact she'd sensed from the first day she'd walked into his corner office with its wide windows overlooking the city skyline. How could he not? She was beautiful, a trait she'd learned to wield like a tool. Her dark hair cascading in soft waves over her shoulders, meticulously styled each morning with a curling iron she'd saved up to buy, and her piercing green eyes that seemed to cut through the haze of cigarette smoke that perpetually lingered in the air. She carried herself with a confidence that belied her age, her heels clicking assertively against the polished floors, her chin tilted just so. But it wasn't just her looks that caught his attention, though they certainly didn't hurt. It was her ambition, that raw, unpolished hunger for success that radiated from her every action, whether it was the way she stayed late to retype a memo he'd scribbled on a napkin, or how she anticipated his needs before he even voiced them. He saw something of himself in her, a reflection of the man he had been 2 decades ago, when he was younger and unburdened, before the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood had settled onto his shoulders like a heavy coat he couldn't shed. At first, their relationship had been strictly professional, a clear line drawn in the sand between them. He was her boss, Mr. Daniel Hargrove, a name that carried weight in the firm, a man in his early 40s with a reputation for sharp business acumen and a temper that could flare like a sudden storm. She was his secretary, Eleanor Ellie Mason, a title she wore with pride even as she dreamed of something grander. Their interactions were confined to the crisp exchange of memos, the scheduling of meetings with clients whose names she memorized like a litany, and the occasional nod of approval when she handed him a perfectly typed report. But as the months went by, the lines began to blur, softening like ink bleeding across damp paper. They would stay late at the office, the rest of the staff long gone, the building quiet save for the hum of the radiator and the distant clatter of the janitor's cart. They worked on projects together, contracts, proposals, presentations, tasks that demanded their combined focus and gave them an excuse to linger in each other's presence. During those late nights, the conversations would turn personal, slipping past the boundaries of professionalism with a gradual inevitability. He would lean back in his leather chair, loosening his tie with a weary sigh, and tell her about his struggles at home. His voice would soften as he spoke of the growing distance between him and his wife, Margaret, a woman he described as cold and preoccupied with her bridge club and charity luncheons. He'd confess how their marriage had become a series of polite exchanges over breakfast, the silence between them thicker than the morning fog that rolled in from the bay. He'd talk about the pressure of being a father to two young children, Thomas, 6, with his endless questions, and little Clara, 3, who clung to her mother's skirts and barely knew him beyond the man who came home late and kissed her forehead before bed. Ellie would listen, perched on the edge of her chair, her notepad forgotten in her lap, offering words of comfort and understanding that felt genuine because they were. She'd tell him he was doing his best, that it wasn't his fault things had drifted, that he deserved more than a life of quiet resignation. In return, he would praise her work, his words laced with a warmth that made her chest tighten. "You're destined for great things, Ellie," he'd say, his hazel eyes catching the dim light of the desk lamp, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've got a fire in you. Don't let anyone put it out." She'd blush, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, and murmur a thank you, though inside she was glowing, her ambition stoked like a furnace. Those moments felt like a pact, an unspoken agreement that they were allies in a world that demanded too much and gave too little. It was during one of those late nights, nearly 10 months into her tenure, that the first spark of something more had ignited. A moment so vivid she could still feel its heat months later. They had been working on a presentation for a major client, a shipping magnate whose account could elevate the firm, and Daniel's career to new heights. The office was a mess of scattered papers, coffee cups with cold dregs, and the faint scent of his cologne mingling with her lavender perfume. The tension between them had been palpable, a current humming beneath their every word, their every glance. She had leaned in to point something out on the screen of the bulky typewriter, her sleeve brushing the edge of his desk, and their hands had brushed a fleeting touch, her fingers grazing his knuckles as she adjusted the paper. The contact had been brief, no more than a heartbeat, but it had sent a jolt of electricity through both of them, sharp and undeniable. He had looked at her then, really looked at her, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. In his eyes she saw something shift, a flicker of desire, a question, a possibility. Her heart raced, pounding against her ribs like a caged bird, and she wondered if he could hear it in the stillness. She didn't pull away, didn't retreat to the safety of her chair. Instead, she held his stare, her green eyes wide and searching, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, though no words came. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, until he cleared his throat and turned back to the typewriter, muttering something about needing to finish the slide. But the air had changed, charged with a new awareness that neither could ignore. From that moment on, it was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood they'd both been holding back. The flirtation became more overt, a dance of words and gestures that thrilled her even as it unnerved her. He'd compliment her dress, a emerald green number she'd splurged on with her first paycheck, saying it brought out her eyes, his voice low and deliberate. She'd laugh a little too brightly, brushing her hair back in a way she knew he noticed. The touches grew more frequent, no longer accidental, a hand on her shoulder as he passed her desk, his fingers lingering a second too long, her handing him a file and letting their fingertips meet, a silent acknowledgement of the shift. The glances were more lingering, stolen across the office during meetings, his eyes finding hers over the rim of his glasses, her catching his reflection in the window as she pretended to adjust her notes. Their late nights became a ritual, an unspoken agreement that neither questioned. They'd order takeout from the deli downstairs, pastrami sandwiches for him, a turkey on rye for her, spreading the wax paper across his desk like a picnic. They'd share a bottle of soda, passing it back and forth, their fingers brushing with every exchange. She'd kick off her heels under the desk, flexing her aching feet, and he'd tease her about working too hard, though his tone was laced with admiration. They'd talk about everything and nothing. His childhood on a farm upstate, her dreams of seeing Paris someday, the latest headlines in the evening paper. The work was always there. A tether to reality, but it was secondary to the connection growing between them, a thread pulling tighter with each passing day. And then, one night, after a particularly stressful day, March 20, 2025, she'd later recall, the date etched into her memory, everything changed. The client presentation had gone awry, the shipping magnate storming out after a heated argument with Daniel over contract terms. The office had been a battlefield of raised voices and crumpled papers, and by the time the dust settled, it was just the two of them, the clock ticking past 9. He'd slumped into his chair, rubbing his temples, his tie discarded on the desk, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. She'd stayed, tidying the mess, her movements brisk but her mind elsewhere. He'd watched her silent for a long moment, before speaking. "Ellie," he'd said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "stay for a drink. I think we've earned it." She'd paused, a stack of files in her arms, and met his gaze. The invitation hung between them, heavy with implication. She'd known what it meant, had known from the way his eyes softened, from the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for the bottle of bourbon stashed in his bottom drawer. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the precipice she'd been inching towards since that first electric touch. Her heart pounded in her chest, a wild, erratic rhythm, and her mind raced with possibilities, consequences, desires, the life she wanted and the risks it entailed. She could say no, retreat to the safety of her role, keep the line intact. Or she could step forward, cross it, and see where it led. "Yes," she'd said, setting the files down, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I'd like that." And so, she had gone, her heels clicking softly as she crossed the room to his office. Her heart a drumbeat, her mind alight with the unknown. He poured the bourbon into 2 chipped keki mugs, the only clean vessels left, and handed her one with a crooked smile. They'd clink them together, a toast to nothing and everything. And as the liquor burned down her throat, she'd felt the world tilt, the future unfurling before her like a map she couldn't yet read. The affair had been going on for months now, a clandestine rhythm woven into the fabric of their lives, and it had settled into a routine of sorts, as predictable as the ticking of the office clock, yet laced with an undercurrent of danger that kept it electric. They would meet in his office after hours, when the building was a hollow shell of its daytime bustle, the fluorescent lights dimmed to a soft hum, and the only sounds were the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their careful steps, and the occasional clatter of a distant elevator. Other times they'd steal away to a hotel room downtown, a modest establishment called the Regal, tucked between a pawn shop and a diner on a street where the neon signs flickered like tired stars. It was a place where anonymity was assured, where the desk clerk barely glanced up from his newspaper, and the walls were thick enough to muffle their secrets. They'd check in under false names, Mr. and Miss John Carter, a nod to a pulp novel he'd once read. Her handwriting shaky as she signed the register, his steady as he slid cash across the counter, no questions asked. It was thrilling, the secrecy of it all, a high-wire act that sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. The knowledge that they were doing something forbidden, something that could unravel everything she'd built in her year and a half at the firm, was a drug she couldn't quit. She'd catch herself smiling at the thought during the day, while typing a memo or pouring his morning coffee, her lips curling into a private curve as she remembered the brush of his hand against her back. The way he'd whisper her name, Ellie, like it was a prayer. But it was also exhausting, a weight that pressed down on her with every stolen moment. The constant fear of being caught gnawed at her like a persistent ache. Every creak of the stairwell, every sidelong glance from a coworker, every ring of the telephone made her heart lurch, wondering if this was the moment it all came crashing down. And then there was the guilt. A shadow that lingered at the edges of her mind, whispering accusations she couldn't fully silence. She'd see his wife's name, Margaret, on a letterhead or hear him mention his children in passing, and it would twist inside her, a dull blade she tried to ignore. She had tried to push the guilt aside, to bury it beneath the glittering promises he dangled before her, to focus on the tangible benefits of their relationship. He had promised her a promotion, a raise, a chance to prove herself in ways she never could have imagined when she'd first walked into his office, with her crisp new blouse and her dreams of climbing the ladder. And he had delivered on those promises, piece by piece, like a man laying bricks for a castle she could one day rule. 3 months into the affair, he'd called her into his office, not for one of their late-night trysts, but for a formal meeting, and slid a letter across the desk. Assistant to the Director of Operations, it read, her name typed neatly at the top. A title that came with a corner desk of her own and a salary bump that let her move out of her crumbling apartment into a modest but clean flat with a view of the river. He'd given her more responsibility, client meeting to lead, reports to draft, presentations to deliver, opportunities to shine that made her feel like the woman she'd always wanted to be. Her colleagues noticed, some with admiration, others with envy, whispering behind their coffee cups about how quickly little Ellie Mason had risen. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about the promotion, the raise, the new title embossed on her business cards. She was drawn to him, helplessly and irrevocably, to the though he wielded with the ease of a man who'd spent 2 decades carving his place in the world. Daniel Hargrove wasn't just her boss anymore. He was a force presence that filled every room he entered, his broad shoulders squared beneath tailored suits, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. She was captivated by the way he made her feel when they were together, desired, seen, alive in a way that transcended the monotony of her days. In his office, with the door locked and the blinds drawn, he'd pull her close, his hands firm on her waist, his breath warm against her neck, and she'd forget the world outside. In those moments, she wasn't just a secretary or an assistant. She was his equal, his confidant, his muse. The power dynamic thrilled her, the way he could shift from stern director to tender lover in the span of a heartbeat, his hazel eyes softening as they traced her face. For him it was different, a tangle of emotions he couldn't fully unravel. He loved his wife, or at least he thought he did, clinging to the memory of what they'd once been. Margaret had been his college sweetheart, a bright-eyed girl with a laugh that used to light up their tiny apartment when they were newlyweds scraping by on his first job salary. They'd built a life together. 15 years, a brick house in the suburbs with a manicured lawn, 2 children whose crayon drawings decorated the fridge. But the passion that had once defined their relationship had faded, eroded by time and the mundane routines of married life. Mornings were a checklist, coffee brewed, kids dressed, a peck on the cheek before he left for the office. Evenings were a tired dance of dinner, bath time and separate silences, her engrossed in a novel, him staring at the television without seeing it. He had tried to rekindle the spark. God knows he had. Date nights at the Italian place they used to love, a weekend away at a cabin by the lake, even a fumbling attempt at romance with flowers he'd picked up on a whim. But it was no use. Margaret would smile, thank him, and retreat back into her shell, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own home. And then she had come along, Ellie, young and vibrant, with a hunger that matched his own from years past, a fire he'd thought had long since burned out in himself. She'd started as his secretary, a girl with a quick mind and a quicker smile, but she'd become something more, something he couldn't define. She made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years, stirring a part of him he'd buried beneath the weight of responsibility. In her presence, he wasn't just Daniel Hargrove, husband, father, director. He was a man again, raw and unscripted. Their first kiss, months ago in his office, after that fateful drink, had been like a match struck in the dark, sudden, searing, illuminating everything he'd been missing. She'd tasted of bourbon and possibility, her lips soft and yielding, and he'd lost himself in her, the guilt a distant echo he could ignore for the moment. Every encounter since had been a lifeline, pulling him from the gray haze of his days. Her laughter in the hotel room as she kicked off her shoes, the way she'd traced patterns on his chest as they lay tangled in the sheets, the quiet confessions they shared in the afterglow. But even as he lost himself in the affair, a part of him knew that it couldn't last, a cold truth that settled in his gut like a stone. He had too much to lose, his marriage, fragile as it was, still a cornerstone of his life, his family, Thomas and Clara, whose innocent faces greeted him every morning with sleepy smiles, his reputation hard-earned over years of late nights and ruthless negotiations, a name that meant something in the firm and beyond. The risks loomed larger with every passing day, a co-worker catching a whispered phone call, Margaret noticing the faint scent of lavender on his collar, a slip-up in their carefully crafted alibis. He'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling while Margaret slept beside him, her breathing steady and oblivious, and wonder how long he could keep this double life intact. The affair was a house of cards, trembling in the slightest breeze, and yet he couldn't bring himself to end it. Not yet. He'd tell himself it was just a phase, a midlife indulgence he'd outgrow, that he'd find a way back to the man he was supposed to be. But then he'd see Ellie across the office, her green eyes catching his in a fleeting glance. And the resolve would crumble. She'd slip into his office with a report, her fingers brushing his as she handed it over, and he'd feel that jolt again, that pull that defied reason. He'd invent reasons to keep her late, another project, another deadline, knowing full well where it would lead. The lock clicking shut, the bourbon poured, the inevitable surrender. He'd watch her as she moved, the sway of her hips in that green dress he loved, the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, and he'd marvel at how she'd slipped past his defenses, a thief in the night stealing pieces of him he hadn't known he could give. For Ellie, the affair was a tightrope she walked with eyes wide open, balancing the thrill against the terror, the rewards against the cost. She'd lie in her new apartment, the river glinting outside her window, and replay their moments together, the heat of his touch, the weight of his promises, the way he'd look at her like she was the only thing that mattered. She'd tell herself it was worth it, that the guilt was a small price to pay for the life she was building, that she could handle whatever came next. But in the quiet hours, when the city slept and her thoughts grew loud, she'd wonder if she was fooling herself, if the castle she was climbing toward was built on sand, if one day she'd look back and see not a triumph, but a mistake. And yet, like him, she couldn't stop, couldn't let go. Not yet. The pull was too strong, the stakes too high, the story unfinished. It was a Friday evening, March 24th, 2025, and the office was steeped in a stillness that felt almost sacred. The frenetic energy of the workweek having drained away as the clock ticked past 6. Most of the employees had fled for the weekend, their desks abandoned with scattered pens and half-empty coffee cups, the air thick with the lingering scent of mimeograph ink and cigarette smoke. The 5th floor of Hargrove & Associates was a ghost town, save for the soft glow spilling from Daniel Hargrove's corner office, where the blinds were half drawn, casting slanted shadows across the hardwood floor. Eleanor Ellie Mason was inside, perched on the edge of his imposing mahogany desk, her posture deliberate, her legs crossed in a way she knew would catch his attention. She'd worn the emerald green dress he liked, the one that hugged her curves just right, its hem riding up slightly as she shifted, revealing a glimpse of her silk stockings. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her green eyes glinted with a mix of mischief and intent as she watched him. Daniel stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, his hands resting lightly on her thighs. His tie was loosened, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone, and his usually meticulous hair was slightly tousled from running his fingers through it, a habit she'd come to recognize when he was on edge. His hazel eyes, normally sharp and calculating, were dark with desire, the kind of look that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch in her throat. The air between them crackled, charged with months of stolen moments and unspoken promises, the office a cocoon shielding them from the outside world. "You're playing with fire," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous, a gravelly edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine. He leaned closer, his palms pressing more firmly against her thighs, the fabric of her dress bunching slightly under his grip. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something faintly spicy, mingling with the faint trace of bourbon on his breath from the drink they'd shared earlier, poured from the bottle he kept stashed in his desk drawer. Ellie smiled, a slow, seductive curve of her lips that she'd perfected in the mirror, knowing full well the effect it had on him. "Maybe I like the heat," she replied, her voice teasing, laced with a boldness that belied the nervous flutter in her chest. She tilted her head slightly, letting her hair spill over one shoulder, and reached out to trace a finger along the edge of his jaw, feeling the faint stubble that had begun to shadow his skin after a long day. His breath hitched, a sharp intake that told her she'd struck the right chord, and she reveled in the power she held in that moment, the power to unravel a man who commanded boardrooms and bent clients to his will. He leaned in, closing the scant distance between them, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Her hands slid up to his shoulders, fingers curling into the fabric of his suit jacket, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened, igniting a familiar fire that had been smoldering since their affair began. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. No ticking clock, no distant hum of the city beyond the windows, no weight of guilt or consequence. It was just them, tangled in a bubble of heat and longing. The desk creaking faintly under her weight as she shifted to press herself against him. But then, the sound of the door opening shattered the moment like glass hitting concrete, a jarring intrusion that sliced through the haze of their intimacy. They both froze, their lips still inches apart, breath mingling in the suddenly frigid air. Ellie's heart lurched into her throat, her hands tightening reflexively on his shoulders, while Daniel's grip on her thighs stiffened, his body going rigid, as if bracing for impact. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity as they turned their heads in unison toward the doorway. Margaret Hargrove stood there, framed by the threshold, her petite figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a stylish hat, her coat still buttoned from the chilly evening outside, but it was her eyes that seized the room, wide with shock, glinting with a raw, visceral betrayal that made Ellie's stomach twist. Margaret's lips parted, a silent gasp escaping as her gaze darted from her husband to the young woman perched on his desk, the scene before her a tableau of infidelity she couldn't unsee. She clutched a small overnight bag in one hand, its leather handle creased from her grip. A prop in the lie she'd spun earlier that week. She'd told Daniel she was visiting her sister in Connecticut for the weekend, a trip she'd detailed with casual precision over breakfast. The train departure at noon, the dinner plans with her nieces. It had been a trap, Ellie realized with a sickening lurch, a carefully laid snare to catch them in the act. And now The room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating, a palpable force pressing down on all three of them. The faint tick of the wall clock was deafening in the stillness, each second a hammer blow against the fragile shell of their secret. Ellie slid off the desk, her heels hitting the floor with a soft thud, her hands smoothing her dress in a futile attempt to reclaim some semblance of dignity. Daniel stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, his face a mask of conflicted emotions, shock, guilt, and something that might have been fear. Margaret didn't move, didn't speak, her eyes locked on her husband as if trying to reconcile the man she'd married with the one standing before her now, his lips still faintly red from another woman's kiss. And then, without a word, she reached into her purse. The sleek black clutch she'd set on the floor flew to her bag, and pulled out a gun. It was small, a snub-nosed revolver that gleamed dully in the lamplight, its barrel short but menacing. She held it with both hands, her grip unsteady but resolute, the metal trembling slightly as her fingers tightened around it. Ellie's breath caught, a sharp gasp that broke the silence, and she took an involuntary step back, her hip bumping against the desk. Daniel raised his hands, palms out, his voice low and urgent as he said, "Margaret, put it down, let's talk about this." But Margaret's eyes were wild now, tears brimming at the edges, her composure cracking like thin ice. "Talk?" she whispered, her voice a jagged edge of pain and fury. "What is there to talk about, Daniel?" "This?" She gestured with the gun, sweeping arc that encompassed Ellie, the desk, the rumpled papers scattered from their earlier haste. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the reality of the weapon sank in, a cold, hard truth that turned their illicit dance into something far more perilous. Sadie, Ellie's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and regret, while Daniel's gaze flickered between his wife and the gun, his world teetering on the brink of collapse. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the office, a sharp, deafening crack that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. He fell to the ground, his body crumpling in a heap, blood beneath him. She screamed, a sound of pure terror, but it was too late. His wife turned the gun on her, her eyes filled with a cold, unrelenting fury. "You thought you could take him from me," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You thought you could destroy my family?" She pulled the trigger, and the world went black. The news of the murder-suicide spread quickly, shocking the community and leaving everyone who knew them reeling. The office was closed for days as the police conducted their investigation, and the employees were left to grapple with the reality of what had happened. For her, it was a tragic end to a life that had held so much promise. She had been young, ambitious, and full of potential, but her desire for success had led her down a path of destruction. And for him, it was a reminder of the consequences of betrayal, of the price that had to be paid for giving in to temptation. In the end, their affair had cost them everything: their lives, their futures, and the lives of those they had left behind. And as the dust settled, the world moved on, leaving their story as a cautionary tale of the dangers of ambition, desire, and the choices we make.